câu đa rôn thời sáng. Vì tôi vợ ni là câu ha rục sư nước ra mây ngăn nên nhớ là Rohany Karya của mai đom về luật chăm trầy nên là câu
We'd like to invite Ms. Rohany Karya, a Champa attorney, who's here to talk about legal issues that affect indigenous peoples.
Is this better? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Kasim, and all the organizers that invited me here today. I'm very proud to be here amongst all the Chams in this room. My name is Rohany Karya. I am an immigration attorney, and I presently live in Washington State, in Olympia. Before that, I was living in Florida, practicing family law there, and I switched over to immigration law. And I was asked to speak on legal issues today that may affect indigenous groups. We heard earlier from the panelists on issues that affect indigenous groups on the global spectrum, but my speech today is kind of limited to just effects on indigenous groups that may have experienced persecution or oppression, and some of the legal remedies that may be available to indigenous groups. So, as most of you are, I'm also a refugee. I was born in a refugee camp en route here from when my parents left the Khmer Rouge regime, and somewhere in Thailand, in a refugee camp, I was born en route here. So a lot of the people that are also in this room are either came in as refugees or have entered around the time of the Vietnam War or the Khmer Rouge regime. So the context of what I'm talking about is when someone is persecuted because of their identity as being an indigenous group, and they're here in the United States, or if they're seeking protection from the United States, what are some of those legal remedies? And before I dig into that, I want to just identify what a refugee is and what an asylee is. I work predominantly with a lot of different immigrant communities. Some are refugees, some are asylees, and some have no lawful statuses. There's really not much of a difference in the definition of who is a refugee and who is an asylee. A refugee is someone who is seeking to enter this country while they're abroad, okay? So sometimes, like myself, while in a refugee camp, usually through a UN refugee organization such as the UNHCR, they seek protection to enter into the United States. An asylee is someone who is already here, or in some cases at a US border checkpoint, and is seeking protection from the US to remain in the US because of a fear, some form of fear. And so in both cases, the commonality is the fear in being persecuted, or the experience of oppression. Okay, so both are fleeing some form of persecution. And persecution can be on account of many things. It could be on account of the person's race, being Cham, being Montagnard, being Rade, being Khmer Krom, or their religion, or their nationality, or even a membership of a particular social group, such as being an indigenous, part of an indigenous group. That is a particular social group that you can claim why you're being persecuted on, okay? Now, the UN doesn't officially define the term indigenous, but rather permits groups to self-identify as indigenous. And it recognizes certain immutable characteristics that make them indigenous. And there are many different characteristics that could make a certain group be considered indigenous. It could be their distinct language, their distinct customs, their distinct tie to their homeland. And so I did have some slides, but I don't think it's up right now. is it? Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't following my slides. But on one of my slides, I did have a list of just examples of current indigenous groups that we may be familiar with and that are in the news right now, such as the Rohingyas, okay? And so the mass persecution of the Rohingyas because of their identities and on account of their identity and their religion kind of goes tie into, you know, where I'm going with this, and some of the other indigenous groups that could fear persecution for similar distinctive characteristics, okay? And they identify themselves as being indigenous because of their rights to that homeland, or they identify as being indigenous because of their distinct language and culture, which you heard earlier during the first panel, some of the Montagnards, some of the Khmer Kroms, and there was also talks about some of the other indigenous groups and how some of the worldwide persecution are being reported with Amnesty International and some of the other organizations that actually report on those incidents. So Myanmar is also another group that are also recently been persecuted. Just a few weeks ago, or maybe a few months ago, I read about Montagnards who were trying to flee Vietnam and trying to get into Cambodia as asylees, and they were denied and they were forced to return back. So being Montagnard is a distinct identity that, but for their indigenous identity, they could have been accepted, you know, or they could have remained in Vietnam, but they felt they had a fear of persecution. They felt there was some sense of oppression, and they were seeking asylee status in Cambodia. And unfortunately, Cambodia rejected that, and they had to return back to Vietnam. So that also happens here in the United States. So there are two legal remedies that are available to indigenous groups. If they are currently facing fear of persecution, whether it's already going on in their home country conditions have changed and it's become too severe for them to return to their home country, they can either seek refugee status and enter into another country that will accept them, or if they're already here in the United States, whether or not they're here to visit family or they're already here under a different status, but now the country conditions in Vietnam or the country conditions in Cambodia have worsened so they can't return. There's a valid fear of being persecuted. At that point, that legal remedy then is seeking asylum in the United States. So those are the two usual remedies that are available in U.S. immigration law that are available to indigenous groups. Whether or not it's the Montagnards, the Chams, even though at this point, you know, we're having the issue where the Chams haven't been identified as indigenous group. But the fact that they are being persecuted on account of their race, that is a reason that you can also apply for those certain legal remedies. And of course, you know, as an attorney, I always have to tell people this is not everything, and it's not very, you know, this is just the basic information. It's not everything that goes into seeking either of those remedies. There's a lot more that goes into it. So I just want to close with that. I know there's really, this is, you know, I'm just trying to go into the basic information, but if anyone has any questions, after this I'm available to explain some of those legal remedies, but those are the two legal remedies available to indigenous groups that are facing a current fear of persecution or oppression in their home country. Okay. Thank you.
Next, we have Mr. Neil Nai, who is a Montagnard representative, who's going to talk to us about cultural and economic developmental rights issues.
Wow, good afternoon. Well, first of all, it's good to be here, and thank you, Kasim, for inviting us to be part of this event, historical event for the indigenous people of Champa. And I told him that I met him back in Washington, D.C., which is about 3 months ago. And he said, yeah, you need to come in November. You know, I said, well, I got to think about it. No, you don't have to think about it, just come. So, and then we have a little bit talk months later, and I told him that I will make try very best to make available to be able to join the Champa conference in San Jose, November. So, and also I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of our Montagnard community, North Carolina, also in Vietnam, in regard to the cultural and economic issue that they are facing right now in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. So, and the government is carrying out a policy of suppressing and eliminating its native people. That include Montagnard, Khmer Krom, and Cham. These harsh policy has been carried out toward to the Montagnard people, I would say late the 50s and early 60s, until this present time throughout the Central Highland. When you look at it, back in 1954, when the conflict between the French and Vietnamese ended, and the Geneva agreement was signed, and then Vietnam was divided in temporary two countries at the 17th parallel. And years later, when the president of NI冶M became the president of South Vietnam, there's this huge, significant impact on the Montagnard people community in the Central Highland. According to anthropologist Dr. Gerald Hickey, state that, I quote, this event was bringing swift changes for the Montagnard people in the mountain. The Central Highland became part of territory of South Vietnam, or the Republic of Vietnam. And the Highlander now become a Highland compatriot, found themselves among the Cham and the Montagnard and Khmer Krom, classified as ethnic minority instead of indigenous people. As part of the attempt national integration, President Diem adopted a policy of assimilation the ethnic minority into the Vietnamese cultural sphere. This involved decrees and practices designed to impose the Highlander, which is the Montagnard, the social institution and the cultural traits of the Vietnamese. It was an attempt to erasing ethnic boundary, and it was to have profound effects in the Highland for many years to come. The goal of the government of Vietnam is to have complete assimilation of the Montagnard into the Vietnamese cultural domain. That was their ultimate goal for the government of Vietnam. So it is very important to understand that the policy of the government of Vietnam, the policy of assimilation has been carried out over decades. Our Montagnard people in the Central Highland of Vietnam continue to face a discrimination against who we are as a human being, what we did in the past and what we do in the present. We are restricted a wide range of social and government services. That include the job opportunity, healthcare, and also higher education. The Montagnard places at the time, just like I give an example as cemetery, often were destroyed by the government of Vietnam so they can make a new development for the housing. The area that once sacred has been exploited by the government and transformed into a tourist attraction. Also, the traditional names in the Montagnard, for instance, are Vietnamese. The distinctive traditional name for many mountains, rivers, and provinces or cities also changed into Vietnamese language. The Montagnard language books were burned out, and also our language, dialect was prohibited to be taught at school. Ever since that time until this present day. I didn't recall that how I learned to speak the Rade language, because we're not allowed to be taught at school. So I just learn it at home, you know, as I speak with your family member. So these are the intentional policy, and also its attempt to destroy the Montagnard traditional way of life and also our cultural identity. According to also Dr. Gerald Huckey wrote in his book, Free in the Forest, I quote, "As part of effort to bring the Vietnamese culture into the highland, many places names were changed during that period. For example, Cherel become Hào Bon, and Bon Matut, they're also called Lac Yao. Jering also was changed to Zilin, Blau also called Bảo Lộc. Some of the Vietnamese provinces administrators also have their own means of trying to alter their highland, which is the Montagnard tradition. For example, in Dak Lak, the province chief forbid the Rode people to wear loincloth, our traditional clothes, when they came into town, and also required them to be dressed in a skirt or trousers, just like the Vietnamese people did. In Pleiku, for example, officer ordered Jarai refugees to build their new homes on ground, just like the Vietnamese style, rather than piling as it was their own custom. Even though some of the name was changed into Vietnamese until now, but some of the places, nobody wanted to use that name and still called just like before, but some of them actually become the Vietnamese name when they changed it from the Montagnard into the Vietnamese language. And also on the economic right perspective, when the South Vietnam came into being, the government of Vietnam faced socio-economic problems due to the huge influx of refugees from the north. So one way the government of Vietnam deal with this problem was their government initiated the new land reform back in 1956. And this would provide a basic land reform program, development program. Following years, the land development was established in 1957. That program was designed to attain dual goal of developing the Highlander economically and also bring modernization to their Central Highland, to the Highlander, by resettling massive number of Vietnamese refugees into the region. Under the new land reform, the Vietnamese settler in the Central Highland could be given the title of the land when they move in, which is take away our land from the Montagnard people. Since then, the Montagnard began to have a land dispute over the proprietor of the land. The government of South Vietnam stated that the land in the Central Highland is the wilderness. It belongs to nobody. Even though we are the original people that live in the Central Highland, we cannot claim that it was our land. According to the government, they said that land is wilderness. It does not belong to no group. So, even though we knowing that the Montagnard as indigenous people include Cham and Khmer Krom are the landowner of our ancestral territory, but we cannot claim or own our ancestral land. And also a research was done on social and economic development done by Dr. Gerald Hickey as well. I quote, "Back in 1958 and 59, two decrees. That decree was deprived the Highlander, which is the Montagnard people, the right to own the land where they farm. A land dispute is happening even right now throughout the Central Highland of Vietnam. We also have a verbal report on the land confiscation, because the problem, we don't see it happening on the news because people are afraid to report what's happening because they're afraid for retaliation for the people where their land was being taken away. And also, the Montagnard are being pushed off to the place where they cannot make a living. At the end of the day, because when you look at the Montagnard in the Central Highland right now, farming is their fundamental and principle of ways of life. Which if their land was occupied, was taken away by the government, where do they go next? So they are pushing up to the further from the city, which is in the back, further down where they cannot make a living. At the end of the day, they will starve. They face a lot of starvation and disease. That's why it is very important when you look at this kind of policy that imposed on the Montagnard people in Vietnam, they are so intentional and also an attempt to destroy the Montagnard human race and identity. So with that, and I appreciate for inviting us here to be part of this conference, this event. I also enjoy the foods too, and thank you so much, Kasim, and for this all organized to make this event possible. Without your help, we cannot have this kind of event. So thank you so much for inviting us to be and to speak on behalf of the Montagnard people community in North Carolina and also back home in the Central Island. Thank you so much.
Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Michael Tai, my neighbor from Los Angeles, who's going to come here and talk to us about communication and networking.